Long before Oz, Tom Fontana was a writer for the hospital drama St. Elsewhere. He didn't create the show, but in the public consciousness a lot of people tend to associate it with him, probably because he's been nominated for Emmys several times and won one for co-writing the episode Time Heals. While Tom Fontana didn't create St. Elsewhere, it must have had an impact on him because the last episode of Oz borrows so heavily from the last episode of St. Elsewhere. It's so obvious, too, that it's funny that people haven't even picked up on this in the 15 years since Oz ended its run. The last episode of Oz, titled Exeunt Omnes, is not available on YouTube in its entirety, although many scenes from the episode, including the ending, are. The last episode of St. Elsewhere is available in its entirety on YouTube. If you've seen the last episode of Oz, you have an opportunity to see St. Elsewhere and compare the writing to see how deep these similarities are. The end scene of St. Elsewhere is probably more famous than the show itself. A lot of people have at least heard of this thing with the snow globe and the whole Tommy Westphall universe hypothesis that resulted from it. The final appearance of St. Eligius Hospital is shown as snow falls outside. Later on, as Dr. Westphall is at home with his autistic son, Tommy, we see the son playing with a snow globe. When he puts it down, the viewer sees that St. Eligius Hospital is inside the snow globe, and this implies that the entire series was imagined by Tommy Westphall. 15 years later, when Oz had its final episode, we see not a snow globe, but a reference to the snow globe from St. Elsewhere. In the finale, Chris Keller tells Tobias Beecher that he did something to take care of the Aryans in Oz shortly before he commits suicide. We find out that Keller has sent a package to one of the Aryans. The group works the mailroom in Oz. The prisoner, whose last name is Adenauer, opens the package in front of the other Aryans to find a jar of white powder. He opens the jar, and it turns out to be anthrax, and all the remaining Aryans and 2 corrections officers die immediately from inhaling it. Visually, this jar of white anthrax powder is such an obvious visual reference to the snow globe from the end of St. Elsewhere. The actor who plays prisoner number 03A285, Adenauer, is unknown. He's not credited in the episode. He looks like he could be an adult version of Tommy Westphall. It's possible that this actor was purposely cast because of that resemblance. The final episode of St. Elsewhere is about several doctors leaving St. Eligius Hospital. The final episode of Oz, specifically the anthrax scare at the end, could be viewed as a parallel to St. Elsewhere's ending. All of the prisoners in Oz are evacuated. Tim McManus tells CO Sean Murphy that the move is temporary. We'll be back. Someday. Finally, if Tom Fontana truly intended for the jar of white anthrax powder to be symbolic of the snow globe, it's interesting to look at the implications of that. If people accept the popular interpretation that St. Elsewhere was all imagined by Tommy Westphall, and they see Oz as being the same type of narrative, then it would indicate that all the events portrayed on Oz are told according to the memory of Augustus Hill, and that he's been narrating the whole show from the afterlife, instead of just the 6th season. In that case, the glass cube he's often shown inside of is actually symbolic of the snow globe, and Augustus Hill is symbolic of Tommy Westphall. Now, does that imply that the end scene of St. Elsewhere is taking place in the afterlife and Tommy Westphall is just remembering his past life when he looks at the snow globe? Who could say? The similarity it shares with Oz challenges the viewer to rewatch the ending of St. Elsewhere to try and understand its true context. In the end, only Tom Fontana could answer these questions. Mr. Fontana was a co-writer of the final episode of St. Elsewhere, and he wrote or co-wrote every episode of Oz, so only he would know how much inspiration he took from St. Elsewhere. Nonetheless, these shared similarities add so much to both shows.